Let's speak to Ben Shalom, the CEO of Boxer, who joins us now. Hi, Ben. Thanks very much for coming on.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Hello.
Thanks for having us. First question, I suppose, should be about clearing up that discussion we were having with Chris Billam-Smith in the last few minutes, which was about the rematch situation with Okolie and Billam-Smith. Is there a rematch clause? Does anyone want to see that again? Are you keen to put it on?
Look, there is. I think with any voluntary defence of a world title, there's usually a rematch stipulation. I think both fighters need some time off. I think Lawrence, it was a difficult, very, very difficult night for him on Saturday night. He'll want to work out what went wrong, how it went wrong, and go back to the drawing board, really. And maybe he'll need some time to do that. And that's what we'll probably encourage. But let's see how the fighters feel next week.
Given the outcome, I mean, obviously we saw, Ben, at the fight, Richard Reactor was there and probably necessarily there to call Lawrence out, and that event didn't manifest itself. Where do you now see Richard Reactor's opportunity? You've got Lawrence Okolie that's standing back when perhaps you're advocating for that, although he's got a rematch in there and you put it in there for a reason. And you've got Richard Reactor on the brink of something. How do you now, you are quite a significant voice in that particular weight class because you've got some of the biggest names in it. What's the plan?
Look, Richard Reactor for me is the best cruiserweight that hasn't got a world title. I've worked with him for 18 months. He's been waiting for this opportunity. We had a plan. The plan for Richard is to fight for a world title next, whether that's Chris Billam-Smith or whether that's Gullam Marian or whether that's Opetaia. His next fight will be for a world title. We have, as you said, significant influence within the division, but we want to see how Lawrence feels, how Chris feels next week. For me, of course, the Richard Reactor, Chris Billam-Smith rematch, which would be a rematch. Richard Reactor, the only man to have ever beat Chris Billam-Smith, would make a lot of sense. But of course, we must look after the interests of Lawrence Okolie, of Chris Billam-Smith, and we'll sit down. But for me, Richard Reactor is the best of the bunch without a world title, and his next fight will be for a world title.
Ben, that was a phenomenal night down there in Bournemouth, a phenomenal week actually, and the atmosphere in that stadium was incredible. It was all Chris Billam-Smith's fans, and you know, they really did make a noise, but the fight itself was not particularly attractive. You know, Billam-Smith done what he had to do to get through that fight and win the contest, and fair play to him for doing that. But the question I want to ask you is, would there be an appetite for the rematch? And if there was a rematch, would you have to go back to the stadium again?
I think you'd have to be confident it would be a completely different Lawrence Okolie, and for me that takes some time. I do think it was a disappointing performance. It was very difficult for Chris Billam-Smith even to attempt a fight with Lawrence Okolie. I thought the referee did extremely well. The right man won. The atmosphere, as you say, the occasion was incredible, and that probably did help Chris Billam-Smith. But yeah, for me, he's built now a huge fan base down there. I expect us to return multiple times to Bournemouth. I feel like he deserves, as a champion, to decide when he fights and where. And so if that rematch were to happen, it would happen in Bournemouth. Whether that happens next, whether that happens in 12 months' time, whether we give a chance to Lawrence Okolie to go and work out really what's gone on, because it really was a very, very difficult night.
It was a difficult night as well, sort of for the watching public, as you've already mentioned. There was some judging controversy too. The 112 draw scorecard, and Okolie not being disqualified. What did you make of that?
I honestly felt like it was such a difficult fight to score. I was sat there with actually Simon on the night, and it was hard to work out what was going on half the time. I think the referee did extremely well. He could have disqualified Lawrence, but I think it gave Chris Billam-Smith that unbelievable moment of winning the fight outright over the 12 rounds, and I think he did everything he could. I think Lawrence has got a difficult job now because every referee and judge will be completely alive to it, and it'll be even harder going forward. As I say, I think it was a difficult fight to judge. I think I've seen a lot of outrage around the 112. I think if you sit back, there are ways where you can see how that judge has got there, but the best man won it in the end. And I think in terms of a real boxing story, in terms of a real feel-good story for the sport, Chris Billam-Smith to win a world title was very, very special.
Benjamin, going back to Lawrence's performance, I mean, obviously there's been a lot made of Lawrence Okolie. He's been in a contract battle for a period of time, and his residence has been overseas, and Shane McGuigan couldn't train him because he couldn't go overseas and train him over there for other things and had other things to deal with. Were you surprised? What do you attribute that performance down to on Saturday? Because whilst we know that Lawrence cannot be the most easiest on the eye, there was something about Lawrence from the moment he walked in the ring, very loose, very relaxed, and it almost seemed like it was lackadaisical at times.
You could forgive him for the David Light performance because obviously the inactivity, etc., and it was not a great performance. He won the fight and won it clearly. But I think everybody was expecting more from Lawrence. And that ring walk, when you saw him and how loose he was and how relaxed he was, you thought, wow, the real Lawrence Cody's turned up here.
What do you attribute it to? I mean, obviously, Ben, you fought to get this guy to come into your stable. He's been in contract disputes with Matchroom. He's there in your stable. We've had 2 fights now. One that we gave him a pass for, even though he got brick-batted by people. But what do you look at it as a promoter? You're privy to more than anyone else is. What do you attribute this to? Just Chris Smith being better? Or something about Lawrence that is not going in the right direction?
I'll be honest, there's been multiple warning signs for Lawrence. I think the Sislak fight back last year wasn't a good performance. And I think the lead up to that, I don't think he had a good camp. Then David Light happens and you sort of attribute that to 12 months out the ring and a new trainer. But this one, the camp was perfect. The time was perfect. He was on weight. His fitness was good. He had more time with his trainer. I think it must be something mentally. It must be psychological where he reverts to type in a certain situation. And I think whilst you keep winning and whilst you're world champion, you sort of get away with it and maybe you paper over the cracks. And I would say he needed this loss to really look at himself and realise there is a fundamental problem because you can't revert to that every time you get in a spot of bother. And I would say when looking at it, it looks like a psychological issue. It looks like an issue that he needs to overcome.
Okay, and just a quick update, if you can, on the Liam Smith situation. The Smith-Eubank rescheduled rematch, is it happening?
It is. We've having repeated tests this week. Liam Smith is, as I said, I've said before, more devastated than anyone. I expect next week for us to announce a rescheduled date in August. And that's the latest, really. And we're working hard with Liam Smith to make sure we have full news by the weekend.
Jim White and Simon Jordan. Monday to Friday mornings from 10 on AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.